Hey everyone, don't forget to leave a comment letting us know what you thought about the stories and the narration. We really want to hear your feedback to keep improving and bringing you more chilling content. Now, get ready. Let's dive into the stories. The road leading to the house felt darker than usual. The car's headlights barely pierced through the surrounding darkness, and the sense of isolation grew as I drove towards the party. I always liked the idea of having parties at that house far from campus. It meant freedom, no worries about neighbors or rules. But tonight, something was bothering me. Maybe it was the fact that the house was in the middle of nowhere, or the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I wasn't sure, but there was something in the air that kept my mind on edge. As soon as I parked the car, the loud music and the lights coming from the house reassured me that everything was fine. It was just a party, like so many others. I walked to the entrance, still trying to shake off that strange feeling of discomfort. The house stood tall, a bit old, with 2 stories that loomed in the darkness. I stood there for a moment, watching the shadows stretch around it, before finally going inside. I was greeted by a sea of voices, laughter, and pulsing music. The atmosphere inside the house was completely different from the outside. I smiled, relieved, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Tonight would just be another night of fun. As I stepped into the room, I was immediately surrounded by friends. Everyone was immersed in the party mood, drinking, laughing, dancing. But while they were enjoying themselves, I couldn't shake off the feeling of discomfort. The house was packed, more people than I expected, and that only intensified the sense that something was out of place. I looked around, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I remembered a recent fight between 2 seniors, something that still hung in the air even though no one was talking about it. I saw one of them in the distance, and the way he stared blankly at the crowd made me feel even more tense. To make matters worse, there was a guy I had argued with days earlier, and the tension between us seemed to grow with each brief exchange of glances. Though I tried to pretend everything was fine, it felt like the atmosphere around me was becoming heavier, almost suffocating. That house, usually the backdrop for carefree parties, now felt wrapped in a strange, oppressive energy. The night went on, and I did my best to blend in, but I couldn't feel at ease. Everything seemed to be building up to some inevitable climax, though I didn't yet know what it was. As the party went on, I started noticing something I couldn't ignore. A group of people walked in through the front door, maybe 4 or 5 of them, I wasn't sure. They didn't draw much attention at first, but there was something off about them. They were older, didn't mingle like the others, and most unsettling of all, they were disturbingly quiet. They just stood there, watching, almost as if they were analyzing everything around them. I looked at my friends, trying to see if anyone else noticed, but no one seemed to care. I asked one of them if they knew who those people were. He just shrugged, saying they were probably someone's guests. But something about them bothered me. The way they moved through the room, almost invisible, but always present. Their eyes scanned every corner, every person, as if they were searching for something or someone. The music kept playing, laughter echoed, and most people were completely oblivious to what was happening. But I couldn't relax. The feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong kept growing. Every time I caught a glimpse of them, that sense of unease intensified. I didn't know why, but I knew something wasn't right about them. Something that made me want to leave as fast as possible. Then, suddenly, the music stopped. The room, once filled with sound and life, fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, no one understood what was happening. People looked at each other, confused. I thought it might be some technical problem with the speakers until I saw one of the strangers closing the front door and locking it. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a joke, but then another one of them began turning off the lights, one by one. The murmurs of confusion turned into whispers of panic. Before anyone could react, one of the men pulled out a gun and pointed it at us. The sound of a stifled scream echoed in the air, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming fear that filled the room. They started shouting orders, demanding that we hand over our phones, wallets, anything of value. The doors were locked, the windows shut. We were trapped. My body froze. The adrenaline surged through my veins, but I knew that any wrong move could cost me. I tried to shrink into the crowd, trying not to attract attention. The people around me were in shock, and those who hesitated were quickly silenced with even more terrifying threats. The party had turned into a nightmare. Every second that passed, the sense of despair grew. They kept us under constant watch, ready to react to any attempt at resistance. There was no way out. We were completely at their mercy. Panic had fully set in. I looked around and saw the desperation on everyone's faces. Some people were trembling, others crying softly, and the tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. The invaders paced back and forth, watching us like hawks. No one dared challenge them, until someone did. Out of nowhere, one of the students near me made a desperate run for the back door. It all happened too fast. The sound of rushing footsteps, someone shouting, and then one of the invaders tackled him to the ground with a brutal strike. The sickening thud of his body hitting the floor made me flinch. The invader stood there, looking at all of us with a cruel grin. He crouched down next to the student, who groaned in pain and whispered something I couldn't hear. But I knew what it meant. It was a warning. Don't even think about trying anything. Fear consumed me at that moment. My legs felt like they were made of lead, as if the ground itself was pulling me down. There was no more doubt. Any hope of escape had evaporated. I could feel the terror in the people around me, the sound of muffled sobs, the silence broken only by the occasional commands from the invaders. I tried to think of a way out, but every possible option seemed impossible. For a brief moment, there was an eerie silence. The invaders seemed to have gotten what they wanted. Maybe that was it. They would take our things and leave. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The leader looked at us, as if still unsatisfied. And that sudden calm was even more terrifying than any direct threat. We all knew it wasn't over yet. Taking advantage of the chaos and the momentary calm, a few friends and I exchanged quick glances and decided to act. Without thinking too much, we slipped down into the basement, trying not to make any noise. We crept down the stairs, our hearts pounding. The basement was cold and dark, filled with dusty boxes and old furniture. In the silence, all we could hear were our rapid breaths and the distant sounds of the invaders moving around upstairs. We crouched behind some old furniture, trying to hide as best we could. I could barely breathe, the fear choking me. My mind raced, but the only thing I could focus on was the sound of footsteps above us. At any moment, they could come down and find us. I knew we weren't safe, but for now, the basement felt like the only place where we had any chance of avoiding their watchful eyes. Suddenly, we heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Panic surged through us. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, as I listened to the muffled voices getting closer. They were coming. My heart pounded so loudly that I was sure they could hear it. I curled up tighter behind the stack of boxes, wishing I could disappear. When one of the invaders finally appeared in the basement, we all froze. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room as if he was hunting for us. I stayed perfectly still, making myself as small as possible. For a few agonizing moments, he stood there, watching in silence. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Then, without warning, he let out a low, satisfied laugh and went back up the stairs. We didn't know what it meant, but the fear was overwhelming. We knew the nightmare wasn't over. We stayed in the basement for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move. No one wanted to be the first to break the silence. We were completely paralyzed by fear. The sound of the invaders' footsteps faded, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. Had they left? Or were they just waiting for us to make a mistake? Finally, we exchanged nervous glances and decided it was safe to come out. We climbed the stairs slowly, our hearts still pounding, ready for any surprise. When we reached the main floor, the sight that greeted us was devastating. The room, once filled with laughter and music, was now unrecognizable. Objects were scattered everywhere, furniture was broken, and the people, Some were still in shock. Others were quietly sobbing. The invaders had left, taking everything they could carry: phones, wallets, jewelry. But what they left behind was far worse: our sense of safety. Everyone there was marked in a way that wouldn't be easily erased. I looked at my friends, still unable to believe what we had just experienced. We left the house without saying much. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. I knew that night would change me forever. Before, parties were a way to have fun, to forget the worries of everyday life. But now, every time I think about entering an unfamiliar house, an isolated place, my body reacts with fear. That fear has stayed with me since that night. Even now, the memory of those footsteps in the basement still haunts me. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like they're back. And no matter how much I try to tell myself that it's all over, part of me always wonders, did the nightmare ever really end? Ever since I started university, I had heard rumors about an abandoned fraternity at the far end of campus. No one knew exactly why it had been shut down, but the stories circulating among students were always filled with mystery. The most common one involved the disappearance of a student many years ago during a party. They said he was never seen again after that night, and the place was closed shortly afterward. It wasn't uncommon for some groups of students to venture there, especially the more daring ones or those seeking a thrill. I never had the slightest interest in being part of that, but that night, something made me change my mind. Maybe it was the pressure from my friends, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe just the urge to prove to myself that those legends were just that, legends. Jason was the first to suggest the idea. He always had this need to lead and challenge others. Mike, of course, immediately jumped on board, laughing at anyone who showed hesitation. Sarah, Jason's girlfriend, was more cautious but always ended up going along, and Emma, even though she was the quietest of the group, seemed willing to join the adventure. We walked across campus that night, laughing and chatting, but as we got closer to the fraternity, the laughter began to fade. There was something strange in the air, a stillness that didn't belong to that place. When we finally stood in front of the old house, a chill ran down my spine. I wasn't the only one. Everyone fell silent for a moment, staring at the dark, decrepit facade, as if we instinctively knew we were about to enter unfamiliar territory. Jason, always the fearless one, led the group, pushing the rusty door open with a high-pitched creak. He stepped in first, followed closely by Mike, who was laughing, trying to ease the tension with one of his usual jokes. "Maybe we'll find the ghost of that missing guy," he said, chuckling, but his voice seemed forced, as if even he didn't believe his own words. Sarah walked in right behind me, clutching Jason's arm, clearly uncomfortable with the place. "I'm not sure we should be here," she muttered, but he ignored her, moving further into the dusty living room. The place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Old furniture covered in dust was scattered around, and the broken windows let in a cold breeze that made the curtains sway softly, like ghosts watching us. Emma was restless. Her eyes darted around quickly, as if she expected something to jump out from the shadows at any moment. "Let's just explore a bit and get out," I suggested, trying to hide my own apprehension. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. As we moved further into the house, the walls seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavy, loaded with a tension none of us could explain. Every step we took felt more hesitant than the last. The house had a presence, something we couldn't see but could feel, watching every move we made. Jason tried to maintain control, but even he seemed less confident than when he had first suggested the idea. Something was definitely wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. While Jason and Mike explored the rooms around us, the silence in the air was almost tangible. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the empty space, and the dust seemed to dance in the faint glow of our flashlights. Then, the first sound came. It was muffled, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere beneath us. I stopped walking, and Emma, who was beside me, did the same. "What was that?" she asked, her voice low but full of apprehension. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the sound of the house settling. But for some reason, my eyes were drawn to the stairs leading down to the basement. That sound, it seemed to be coming from there. "It's just the wind or some animal," Mike shouted from the other side of the room, still trying to joke around. But his voice sounded different now. Nervousness was beginning to take hold of all of us. The sound repeated. Thumps, faint, like something trapped down there, trying to get out. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple, despite the cold inside the house. Emma clutched my arm, her eyes fixed on the stairs to the basement. "That's not just the wind," she whispered, clearly scared. Jason returned to where we were, frowning. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, no longer as confident as before. Before we could answer, the basement door creaked slightly, opening just a crack on its own, as if something down there wanted to invite us in. Sarah instinctively backed away, and I took a step back as well. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, but Jason shook his head. "No, we need to see what that is. It's probably just the old structure of the house," he said, trying to convince himself more than us. I knew that wasn't normal. Doubt started to settle in, and what had been just a fun night was starting to feel much darker. The tension was visible on everyone's face. Even Mike, who had been trying to keep things light, wasn't joking anymore. Jason walked slowly toward the basement door, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. "It's just an old abandoned house, guys," he repeated. But his voice no longer carried the carefree tone it had before. He pushed the door open completely, revealing the deep darkness of the stairs leading down. The air rising from the basement was even colder, and the smell of mildew was strong, like the basement hadn't been opened in decades. Jason started descending the steps, and with no other option, we followed behind, each of us with our hearts pounding harder. As we went down, the thumps grew louder, as if something was calling us. The darkness around us felt heavier, more suffocating. Our flashlights barely illuminated the path, and the sound of our footsteps echoed everywhere. Whatever was in the basement, we could feel its presence. It seemed to be in every corner at once, surrounding us, watching. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, something moved in the darkness. It was quick, like a shadow sliding along the walls. "Did you guys see that?" Sarah whispered, almost in tears. Jason didn't respond, but the silence on his face said it all. He had seen it too. And then the thumping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. We stood there, frozen, as if waiting for the next move. And it came. The doors upstairs suddenly slammed shut, one after the other, as if something was running through the house, locking us down here. Emma screamed, and I felt panic taking over. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, but the stairs behind us seemed even longer now, as if the way back had disappeared. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the walls seemed to breathe. Something was alive in this house, something we didn't want to meet. I could feel it. There was no more doubt. We were being hunted. Desperate, we ran toward the stairs, but it felt like the air around us was getting thicker with every step we took. It was as if something was pulling us back, keeping us from escaping. The thumps that had once come from the basement now echoed through the entire house, as if they were all around us, within the very walls. Each thump sounded like a warning that we were in danger. Jason was the first to reach the stairs, but when he tried to climb, he stopped abruptly. What is that?" His voice trembled for the first time. When I looked, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The shadows at the foot of the stairs seemed to take shape, slowly materializing into figures that moved on their own, drifting toward us. They didn't have defined faces, only dark, distorted shapes, but it was clear they were watching us, waiting for the right moment. Mike shoved Jason, trying to be the first to climb, but he tripped and fell to the floor, gasping for breath. "Let's get out of here," he screamed, but the shadows were getting closer. Emma stood frozen, paralyzed with fear, unable to move a muscle. "Emma, come on," I yelled, but she barely managed to respond. That's when we heard the screams. Coming from somewhere above us, they were loud and full of anguish, as if someone was being tortured. Hearing them was like a punch to the gut, and I felt my body freeze. That missing student," Sarah murmured, her eyes wide with terror. She was right. Those screams didn't just sound like echoes from the past. They felt real, alive, as if what happened all those years ago was still happening. The shadowy figures moved faster, and panic took hold of us. Jason grabbed Sarah's hand and started running back toward the stairs. "Go," he shouted at me. Without thinking, I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her along. We had to get out before it was too late. We ran up the stairs, and it felt like the entire house was trying to hold us back. The doors slammed shut with force, the wind howled through the broken windows, and the screams continued to echo everywhere. Every step was a battle against fear, but we finally made it to the front door. As we stepped outside, the silence returned. There were no more screams, no more thumping, no shadows chasing us. Only the cold night air and the sound of our heavy breathing. We stopped, exhausted, in front of the house, staring at it as if trying to process what had just happened. I saw those shadows," Mike whispered, still pale. No one said anything for a moment. Whatever had been inside that house, we knew it wasn't something we could explain. Something, or someone, was still in that fraternity, and we had disturbed its rest. The university never talked about what happened that night. To everyone else, it was still just a legend. But to us, it wasn't a story to scare freshmen anymore. It was real. Even now, I can still hear those screams when I close my eyes. And when I pass by that old fraternity, I get a chill that never goes away. Something is still in there, lurking, waiting for someone bold enough to enter again. College life was just beginning for me. The first days were a mix of nervousness and excitement. The campus was huge, with new opportunities around every corner, but there was one thing I was eager to experience: the parties. It was during a class that I first heard about the Omega Pi fraternity. One of the upperclassmen casually mentioned an exclusive party for freshmen, something that seemed like a unique opportunity for anyone wanting to fit in. At the end of the class, the upperclassman approached me with a friendly smile, handing me a flyer with the date and location of the party. "It's going to be fun. You should go," he said casually, but something in his gaze made me uneasy. It was as if there was a hidden meaning behind his words. Rumors circulated about that fraternity. They said that, years ago, a hazing ritual had gone wrong and resulted in the death of a student, but no one knew the full details. The university administration had hushed up the story, and everything remained as whispers in the halls. Still, the invitation was irresistible. On the night of the party, I, along with other freshmen, headed to the fraternity house, which was far from the main campus. The path there was dimly lit, and the place felt isolated. As we got closer, the loud music and chatter filled the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Deep down, I knew that night could be more than just a party. Getting into the house was easy. The place was packed, with freshmen and upperclassmen moving from one side to the other, drinks in hand, laughing and shouting. It was the kind of atmosphere I expected, but the unease remained. The dim lighting and the arrangement of the furniture gave the place a strange, almost claustrophobic feel. As we mingled with the crowd, a few upperclassmen started calling the freshmen's attention, saying the real fun would take place in the basement. I laughed along with the others, trying not to show my concern, but there was something in the way they said it that made me hesitate. Still, I followed the group. The basement was completely different from upstairs. The concrete walls and dim lighting created a tense atmosphere. As we descended the stairs, I realized the space was much tighter than I had imagined, and the loud music from upstairs now seemed distant, muffled. The leader of the upperclassmen, a tall guy with a sinister smile, welcomed us into the basement with an oddly energetic demeanor. "Welcome to our little game," he said as the other upperclassmen blocked the staircase. The air grew heavy, and I felt like we were being closely watched. Chairs were arranged in a circle, and it quickly became clear that we were about to take part in something very different from what we expected. Once all the freshmen were seated, the leader of the upperclassmen walked slowly around the circle, his smile still plastered on his face. He looked at us like we were pieces in a game, and the tension was palpable. "Let's start easy," he said, pulling a kitchen knife out of his pocket. The blade gleamed under the dim light, making my stomach turn. He handed the knife to one of the freshmen and pulled an apple from a box resting against the wall. "All you have to do is cut this," the upperclassman said with an almost playful tone. The freshman, nervous, hesitated. But before he could say anything, one of the upperclassmen came up behind him and blindfolded him with a piece of dark cloth. I felt my breath quicken. Something about this game was very wrong. Cutting an apple while blindfolded didn't seem exactly dangerous, but the air in the basement was thick with a tension that couldn't be ignored. The freshman tried to hit the apple, but his hands were shaking. On the third slice, he missed the target and let out a cry of pain. Blood trickled from his hand, dripping onto the concrete floor. The basement fell silent for a few seconds, and then the upperclassmen began to laugh. The freshman, panicking, tore off the blindfold, clutching his bloody hand. Some of us tried to stand up to help him, but the upperclassmen pushed us back into our chairs, saying he would survive. "Now it's the next one's turn," the leader of the upperclassmen announced, ignoring the injured student. Panic spread among us freshmen. This was no longer a party, much less a game. It was a cruel challenge, and we were completely at their mercy. As the first freshman stepped away, clutching his bloody hand, another upperclassman pulled a second freshman from the circle. This one, visibly more frightened, tried to resist, but was shoved hard against the basement wall, knocking over a glass bottle that had been sitting on a shelf. The bottle fell to the floor and shattered into pieces. Before the freshman could move away, he was pushed again, this time landing on the broken glass. His scream of pain was even louder than the first. Blood stained his leg where the shards had pierced his skin, and he remained still for a moment, dazed by the pain. The basement turned into a scene of chaos. The leader of the upperclassmen laughed again, as if he were enjoying the show, and the other upperclassmen seemed less concerned about the injuries than they should have been. To them, everything was still just a game. But for me, I knew we were in real danger. I tried to stand up, but the upperclassmen wouldn't let me. "If anyone else tries to leave, it'll get worse," one of them threatened, blocking the staircase. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing off the basement walls. The freshman who had fallen was moaning in pain, and the sound of his groans, mixed with the upperclassmen's distorted laughter, was unsettling. We freshmen exchanged desperate looks. We all knew that if we stayed, things would only get worse. But at the same time, the exit was blocked, and the upperclassmen didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. This game had spiraled out of control, and I knew that if we didn't act soon, someone would get even more seriously hurt, or worse. The tension was suffocating. The injured freshman was leaning against the wall, blood still dripping from his leg, while the other upperclassmen circled around us like predators. My heart raced. I knew we needed to get out of there, and fast. There was no time to wait for things to calm down. If we stayed, something even worse was bound to happen. As I watched the leader of the upperclassmen, I noticed a brief moment of distraction. A noise, maybe someone knocking something over upstairs, made him and the others glance toward the door. This was the break we needed. Without thinking twice, I signaled to the other freshmen around me, and together, we made a quick move toward the only window in the basement, which was located on the far wall. One of the freshmen reached the window first. He struggled to open it, pushing with all his strength while the others tried to hold him up. The window creaked loudly as it finally gave way, and adrenaline started coursing through my body. This was it, our only chance. I helped the others climb through the small opening, one by one, while the upperclassmen shouted and ran toward us. The fear of being caught made every second feel like an eternity, but we finally managed to scramble out of the window, feeling the cool night air hit us like a rush of hope. We were free, at least for now. We bolted across the fraternity's backyard, not daring to look back. All I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible, but the sound of fast-approaching footsteps behind us told me the upperclassmen hadn't given up yet. Running down the dark street felt endless. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, and my breathing grew heavier. But suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. Sirens. Police sirens. It was as if a wave of relief washed over me. Someone, probably a neighbor or passerby, must have called the authorities. I glanced back and saw the blue and red lights piercing the darkness, illuminating the scene behind us. The upperclassmen, who had been chasing us, stopped abruptly. They exchanged nervous glances, and without saying a word, began to scatter. A few minutes later, the police arrived at the fraternity's front door, and the remaining upperclassmen were quickly contained. Still out of breath, the rest of the freshmen and I were taken aside to talk to the officers. We told them everything that had happened, from start to finish. The injuries from the freshman who had cut his hand and the other who had fallen on the glass were evidence enough for the authorities to take the situation seriously. However, the upperclassmen, with their rehearsed excuses and cynical smiles, claimed it had all just been a bad joke. Despite the evidence, they managed to avoid any serious punishment, insisting that no one had been forced to participate. That night, we were taken to the hospital, and the injured were treated. But even after escaping physically, the psychological trauma remained. Every time I passed near the fraternity or heard its name mentioned, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't managed to escape in time. The upperclassmen moved on with their lives, unscathed. To them, it had been just another party, a cruel game that ended badly. For me, and for the other freshmen, that night became a defining moment, a constant reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control. And the worst part was knowing that, even far from that fraternity, I would never truly feel safe again.